Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Conor Gray's Kokon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're going to be asking the question of what if the Gallipoli campaign was a success? Now in some of our other videos that I've touched on World War One, we look at the effects of the Treaty of Versailles. We ask the question of what if Britain had stayed neutral in the war, but this campaign here, the Gallipoli campaign, was really pivotal. Now for those who don't know, World War One was made up of obviously the Entente powers, which was Britain, France and Russia, and the Central powers, which were made up of, obviously everyone knows, Germany and Austria. But not so many people know about the Ottomans and the Middle Eastern theatre of the war. Now, the role that the Ottomans had when they joined in with the Central powers was really decisive, because it threatened the British Empire at its most pivotal point. It's very close to the Suez Canal, and it tied down a lot of men. On top of that, it also disrupted the supply lines between the Western allies and Russia, because obviously supplies having to go through the Black Sea and then through the Bosphorus and then past the Dardanelles. Yes, that all goes into Turkish territory, and so by Turkey being on the side of the Central Powers, it meant that this key supply route was hampered. So we're going to obviously dive into some of the details on this. Now, there have been lots of other alternative history videos which have asked this question before. However, a lot of them I found tend to focus a lot on the effects on the Turkey and the Middle East itself, which is fine, but I think that it kind of ignores how it would have affected the rest of the war. And obviously that was the reason the people who came up with the idea, i.e. Churchill and Lord Kitchener, they didn't come up with this idea because of how it would affect Turkey. They did it because of how it would affect the war in total. So that's what we're going to dive into in this video. But before we do all that, don't forget to hit the like button. Just tap it very lightly. Yeah, make it turn blue, because that will really boost the algorithm. And yeah, that's all I have to say on that. Now we're going to get into the rest of the video. Now, the Gallipoli campaign almost succeeded in our timeline, and the only reason why it didn't is because of inaction and arrogance. Now, the arrogance part of it, that was because Turkey had been declining for many centuries, and so yeah, and even in the recent Balkan wars, they've had a complete poor showing of it, and so it was arrogantly kind of believed by the British that, oh, all we have to do is land some men there and then march straight on to Constantinople, i.e. Istanbul, and the whole thing will just come collapsing in. Now, it's quite funny that Churchill came up with the same idea pretty much that he ended up having later in World War II, which was this idea of a soft underbelly. He didn't come up with that exact phrase in World War One, but it was the same kind of logic, which was the Germans being the tough force and stuff, and actually if you go up through the Mediterranean and take out their ally there, then the whole thing, it will be a lot easier to unpick. So in World War II, the soft underbelly was Italy. In World War One, the thinking was that the soft underbelly was the Ottoman Empire. Now, what was quite funny is that in both cases, this so-called soft underbelly proved to be a tough old gut. And this is why we see that the Ottomans were able to hold off a superior British force, both in men and in material. So there was 500,000 Allied troops that landed in the Dardanelles versus just 300,000 Turks, and yet the Turks were able to hold them back. Now, in World War One, the advantage always went to the defending side. This is what you see in the system of trench warfare. Whichever side is able to take the territory and then hold on to it, they're the ones that have the advantage. And so the problem mainly with the Allied offensive was that they landed the troops there and then was like, oh yeah, let's dig in, boys. So they dug trenches and then lost all the element of surprise, which was the whole point of the campaign, and then just sat there and waited for the Turks to build up their numbers and then to start fighting them. So the whole campaign just kind of floundered on the beaches there, and after many months of just complete stalemate, then the British, it was a successful withdrawal, but it was still withdrawal. It's a complete failure, and as a result, it led to the Liberal government in Britain falling in 1916, and Churchill went from being the Lord Admiralty to resigning his position and going to fight on the Western Front. It wasn't really until 1940 he was able to regain any of his reputation. And this is actually why people were so hesitant about making him Prime Minister in 1940, because of his record in campaigns like Gallipoli, where he came up with these great ideas, but then didn't actually think about how they would actually be followed through, and didn't like get it sorted properly to make it an actual success. But if it had been a success, what would have actually happened? Now, if the Allies had just gone there and just continued moving, hadn't stopped, hadn't decided that they were going to, make a cup of tea and just sit like in these trenches, if they'd marched onto Constantinople and taken out the Turks, then they would have freed up many, many men that end up getting bogged down in the Middle Eastern theatre. Now, just give a scale on this. In the Caucasus, Russia had 1 million men that were tied up fighting the Turks. The British Empire had 2.5 million men tied up fighting the Turks. If we think about both the Western Front and the Eastern Front, when we think about what these extra basically 3.5 million men being brought to bear on the Germans and the Austrians, what effect this would have had on the war, considering how closely fought the war was, and how hard the Germans were able to fight, and the British had to fight and the French had to fight. Imagine, for instance, on the Western Front, 2.5 million more men. Imagine on the Eastern Front, 1 million more Russians. So we're going to go on the Eastern Front first. So to be honest, I still think that the February Revolution would have happened. And the reason I say that is because the problems that caused the February Revolution were so ingrained within Russia. It was so, from a top-down thing, people were so fed up with the Tsar, they were so fed up with how the military was run, etc., etc. I think even with these extra million men, I think, yes, it would have helped to a degree. I think it would have helped the Russian war effort, because obviously the Russians already outnumbered the Germans and the Austrians on that front anyway. They already had 2.2 million men compared to the Germans and Austrian combined, who had just 1.2 million. So they had an extra million men, and yet still end up basically losing on the Eastern Front, mainly because of the inefficiency and the poor training and the poorly supplied and poorly fed Russian military, and also poorly led, especially when the Tsar ended up taking over afterwards. But even still, even in spite of that, I think having an extra million Russian men on the front would have perhaps tilted the balance, or at least made it a bit more even. And so the Russians wouldn't have had to retreat as much, the Germans wouldn't have been able to make as much of an advance, and Russia might have carried on fighting the war. Probably they would have fought it to the end, because the only thing that made them leave the war was the Bolshevik Revolution, which I'm very skeptical would have happened this time. The Bolshevik Revolution happened because of a very unique set of events, and the main one being the massive loss of morale for the Russians towards their war effort. The war was unpopular, they were not winning, and they were losing lots of territory, and it was just a complete disaster. If you'd had these extra 1 million men on the front, and there had been less disasters, if there had been more victories, and also obviously the morale boost from the Ottomans being kicked out, and also the supplies coming in from the French and the British through the Black Sea, possibly Russia could have carried on fighting towards the end. I still think that obviously the Tsar, like I said, would have been had to have been deposed, but I think that you still, yes, I don't think that you would have had a Soviet takeover. Now, on the Western Front, the story gets even more interesting, because you had, the British, French, and Belgians combined made up 13.7 million men. The Germans alone made up 13.2 million. So again, the Germans were outnumbered by the Allies. However, again, because they had advanced into France and into Belgium and had taken the industrial part of it, just to give an idea, about 60% of France's coal and steel production was taken, was part of German territory, kind of in World War One. And so the Germans obviously taking all that kind of territory meant that the French war capabilities were not as great as they otherwise would have been. And so all Germany had to do was just advance up to a point and then hold that line. And they knew that they didn't necessarily have to go much further, because at some point the theory was that the French would buckle and that they would break, and then the Germans would march on to Paris. If you'd had an extra 2.5 million men, most of whom came from the Empire, especially from India, Australia, New Zealand, etc., if you'd had these 2.5 million men on that front, I think that the Germans would have been pushed back even more. Yeah, it would have been quite hard for them to have held that line. I'm not saying that the war would have been over by Christmas, but certainly not. But I certainly think that having these extra men would have meant that Germany would have eventually been kicked out of French and Belgian territory and would end up fighting on the home front. And this is something which a lot of alternative history people haven't really focused on when answering this question. They fail to recognise the effect of these 2.5 million men against the Germans, because the whole reason why Hitler rose to power, one of the main tenets of why he rose to power, was based on the back of this stab in the back myth. This myth that the German military had been undefeated in the field. And, you know, from a German soldier's perspective, like Hitler, you could understand it because they were fighting on foreign soil and they had never really been defeated majorly in the field. And yet, you know, Germany ended up surrendering. And so from the perspective of the returning soldiers, they were like, how have we lost this? Yeah, that clearly we've been stabbed in the back by these politicians, by these communists, by these Jews, all these kind of people that were part of the myth as to why Germany lost, when in reality their economy was collapsing. They couldn't feed themselves because of the British blockade of their ports. So yeah, they weren't able to get enough food. So, you know, many people in Germany were starving to death, right? That's why the war ended up collapsing. That's why the armistice had to be signed, because it was a thing of German society was collapsing in and of itself. So while the soldiers at the front line didn't necessarily see that, it was a thing of, in reality, you know, their situation was untenable. And so the collapse in 1918 was an inevitable one in which, you know, they had no choice. I mean, when we think about the impact that America during the war had on the Western Front, we start to get an idea of what these 2.5 million men would have done. You know, America sent 2.2 million men, most of which came in 1918. And yet, even this was able to turn the tide of the war on the Western Front. So, if you'd had 2.5 million men, not in 1918, but in 1916, then we can imagine, you know, like the events changing even more. I think on a conservative estimate, I think that the war could have been over by 1918, like early 1918, possibly even late 1917. Yeah, so it would have been a slightly quicker war, but it also would have been more decisive. The Germans couldn't have argued that they were stabbed in the back. They would actually have been, you know, I don't know how far the Allies would have had to push before the Germans surrendered, but they would have been pushed back. They would have been defeated in the field, and therefore people like Hitler wouldn't have been able to make up excuses of, oh, we were stabbed in the back. No, you were defeated, yeah, and we have the men to prove it. So this is part of the wide effect of how the Ottomans getting kicked out of the war would have had such a dramatic effect on the whole rest of the war, and how the Allies would have won it much sooner. And now finally, yes, we are going to talk about the effects that it had on Turkey and the Middle East in general. Now, Turkey after World War One was divided up by the victorious Allies. And the only reason why Germany didn't end up like every other Middle Eastern power, where it was completely divided up and it stayed like that, is because of one man, and that is Mustafa Kemal, later known as Kemal Ataturk. Ataturk meaning father of the Turks. Now, this man was a very famous general who led the Gallipoli campaign, you know, led the Turkish to victory, boosted morale, showed the Turks that they were a fighting force. And this man, after the war, ended up overthrowing the Sultan and set up the Turkish Republic. And, you know, with his ideology of Kemalism, of having this kind of Western-style, social democratic, secular state, focused on modernity and on, you know, trying to get rid of the past and, you know, trying to westernize and industrialize as soon as possible. This was the man who shaped modern Turkey. So the great power that Turkey is today, we have, you know, Kemal Ataturk to thank for that. So if Gallipoli had been a failure, he wouldn't have been able to rise to prominence as he did in our timeline. Turkey would have been divided, and the effects of this kind of complete collapse, this complete the division, would have been that the surviving Turkish rump state would have basically turned in on itself, and it would have been very much like all the other kind of countries within the Middle East. Turkey today would be divided, and it would be very bitter, and also it would be filled with religious fanaticism, because the effect of Kemalism on making Turkey a secular society, if it wasn't him, it wouldn't have been anyone else. No one else had that kind of that force of personality, that driving, kind of inspiring kind of like leadership. And so if not for him, then Turkey would not have ended up as it has today. So in conclusion, yes, the Gallipoli campaign could have worked if the British had actually decided to, move off those beachheads and actually go forward with it and actually be serious about the campaign, because this was one of the great tragedies of the war, and all the Anzac soldiers who end up being wasted on on those beaches, all the British soldiers who were wasted on those beaches, it was for a completely ill thought out campaign, which was, as I said, based on inaction and arrogance. Yeah, it was the basic belief that as soon as they landed, that the Ottoman Empire would just collapse and they wouldn't really need to put much of a fight at all. And if they'd taken the campaign a bit more seriously, those men wouldn't have had to, die in vain, basically, and the war wouldn't have had to drag on for much longer than it did. And at least as far as I can see, there wouldn't have been a need to fight, the sequel in World War II. So with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this video. The next video is going to be on what if the Crimean War never happened. So we're going to look at all of the ramifications of that war. And yeah, if you enjoyed this video, definitely hit the like button and share with your friends, subscribe, and have a nice day, and bye.